I'm recording my homily for the 24th Sunday of Ordinary Time. And the readings this Sunday are very Lenten. They're about Jesus, his cross, the fact that he's going to die. Even the first reading is a reading from Isaiah that we generally only hear during Lent, this prophecy that the Messiah is going to be beaten and suffer and be humiliated and all these things. And not only that, did we have these readings this weekend, but 2 days before, so on Friday, we had the feast day of the exaltation of the Holy Cross. And so very Lenten also. And then the next day, as we always have after the feast day of the exaltation, is we have the feast day of Mary or Our Lady of Sorrows. And so Our Lady of Sorrows, again, is remembering Mary, especially in that moment when she's with Jesus and he's on the cross, right? Now there's a few other times where Mary obviously suffers, but it's that day when Jesus is suffering. So you have 3 days in a row that are all very Lenten. And I wonder if it's kind of like the way the church is trying to remind us, because it's almost like we're at the farthest point in the year from Lent, right? 6 months to Lent or 6 months from Lent, but it's almost like we're at the other side of our liturgical cycle. And so the church wants us to remind us that Lent, the suffering of our Lord, all of this is something not to be forgotten. Okay, so just having said that, I want to now kind of go into a few of these things, right? Okay. What does it mean to carry one's cross, right? To take up one's cross. Jesus says we have to take up our cross. So a cross is not just something that's bad, okay? It's like, I lost my job, therefore that's my cross. Well, not necessarily. It is something bad, it is a suffering that a person would have to endure, but it's not yet a cross. Something else has to make it a cross, okay? If somebody comes down with cancer, somebody has an illness, somebody has something that's causing them pain, that in and of itself is not the cross per se. What makes it a cross? What makes it a cross is when somebody takes whatever that thing is that's going on in their life, and they turn it into love. That makes it the cross, right? So when Mary was there in front of Jesus, and Jesus is dying on the cross, well, that's the cross, but what made it the cross? What made it salvific? What made it redemptive? It was not that he was dying on the cross, but that he was giving his life out of love. And so he took something bad and transformed it. He took our sins and transformed it into an act of love. Now, obviously for him, it is salvific. For us, we desire to participate in that. And so when we carry our cross, Jesus makes it salvific by turning it into an act of love. So, for example, somebody has cancer, and let's say because of the cancer, they become more grouchy, more impatient, they use foul language, they treat their caregivers horribly, they curse God, all these things. It's not a cross. And it's not salvific at all. They threw down the cross. They rejected the cross. But what about somebody who has cancer, who because of the suffering, because of their cancer, they become more patient, more kind, more understanding of other people who are struggling, so more sympathetic and compassionate towards other people. It transforms their life. They see life differently. They focus their life on heaven, right? That's the cross. That is the cross. I know I've mentioned this before, but I've met people who've said that their cancer was the best thing that ever happened to them because it refocused them. And I would dare say in that, basically what they discovered was how to transform that into love. Therefore it's beautiful, it's the cross. Okay, so we have a sense of the cross, right? About transforming something into love. That's a necessary component. It's not just enduring suffering, but it's transforming it into love. Okay. Little ways that we carry our crosses. Now, before I go into that, last week I talked about Father Augustine Tolton. So Father Augustine Tolton, I finished reading a book on him. The book is called From Slave to Priest, the story of Father Augustine Tolton, and it's by Ignatius Press. Great book, really great book. I would say especially for anybody discerning a vocation to the priesthood. But anyways, so last week I shared with you part of the story. So he's the first African American priest canonized in the United States. This was during the Civil War time. It was right after the Civil War. And so even in the states where there was freedom for slaves, freedom for the African Americans, there was still lots of prejudice and lots of racism. And so Augustine, as a little boy, he starts discerning, becoming a priest because his pastor invited him to discern that. His pastor thought he would be a good priest. And at first, Augustine is like, well, I can't do that because there's no black priests. And so his pastor begins to support him on this journey. Well, as he applies to the different seminaries, every single seminary turns him down because it's controversial, it's going against the grain of the culture. And so all these seminaries are worried at the consequences of going against the culture, the repercussions of taking in an African American into the seminary. And so they all turn him down. Every one of them rejects him in the United States. Now, what is happening? The church is rejecting the cross. Because the cross is the ability to look at our culture, to see the problems, and to transform it into love. And so when we see prejudices, racism, as an example, as a form of suffering on the part of the culture, because it's an evil, then the church is meant to shine like a beacon to the culture. It's not meant to incorporate the culture. It's meant to be a beacon of light to the culture. And it failed. On so many levels, it failed. And not just Father Augustine, but it failed to be that beacon of light. Now, in saying that, there were many, many good people in the Catholic Church who were a beacon of light. For example, his pastor and the subsequent pastors that he had, they took him under their tutelage and they taught him and prepared him and did everything they could so that, God willing, one day he would enter the seminary, he'd be ready, because he wasn't getting a very good education. When he was younger, they tried to get him in the Catholic school. Disaster. Why? Because the Catholics were simply part of the culture. They were racist, they were prejudiced, they were not being a beacon of light, and they were rejecting the cross. So eventually, as I said last week in the story, eventually he does get accepted to seminary, and this is the way Jesus takes the lowly, right? He takes those beaten down. He always notices them, and he chooses to raise them up. Many of our saints are people who fit that model. They were lowly. He takes them and raises them up. So he raises Father Augustine up, and he's accepted into one of the most prestigious seminaries in Rome. Now, Father Augustine would go on to say that was the greatest time of his life. It was the best time of his life. He was so at peace there. He was loved. He was respected. It was a very peaceful time for him. Now, that's where I left the story last week, at the kind of the high point. But what does Jesus do? Jesus takes the lowly, he raises them up, and then prepares them. And you know what he prepares them for? To carry the cross. Right? He prepares them to carry a cross. The holier you get, the deeper you go in your prayer life, the more Jesus Christ is preparing you for, you got it, a cross. Now, you might be thinking, whoa, I think I'm just going to keep arm's length distance from Jesus. I'm going to stay a safe distance away. I'm not going to try to grow in holiness. But that's fear. We don't need that fear, right? We try to go deeper, and then we allow God to work. We surrender to God's love, and we allow Him to work. Now, Jesus was preparing Father Augustine carry a very large cross, okay? So, while he was in the seminary, he was actually preparing to be a missionary in Africa. And so he geared his studies towards that, towards learning the culture, languages, things like that. But in the week before he's ordained a priest, they come to him and say, we are not going to send you to Africa. We're going to send you back to the United States. And we're going to send you back to your home diocese. And we're going to send you back to your home parish. And so this was his bishop and the propagation of faith working together on this, the missionary that he was, the propagation that he was working with. And so the week before he's ordained a priest, he realizes he's going back home. Now, I suppose in most cases that would be a happy experience, but for him, he knew the problems. He knew just how bad it was in terms of the racial dynamics and the prejudices. So he was really, really worried. He was going into this with some fear and trepidation. But anyways, he's ordained a priest and he goes back home. Now, he becomes the pastor immediately of his home parish. Things went okay. He was doing okay. I'd say, one, it's cruel to make a priest a pastor right away. But anyways, that's what they did. He was doing okay. But there were issues. So he was struggling to bring the faith, obviously, to the African Americans. And there was lots of issues there, and so it was hard to bring it to them. But he was working at it. He was trying hard. He was not feeling the love per se in some ways, because it was a hard group to bring the Catholic faith to because of the racial problems. But he was having some success also in his ministry, also with the Anglos, with the white people. There was some people coming to his parish. Well, some of the other priests in the area didn't like that. His ministry specifically was to the African Americans. And so they didn't like the fact that white people were now going to his church. They became jealous. There's this one priest in particular who became incredibly jealous of him. And he was incredibly vengeful and hateful towards Father Augustine, probably racist as well. And so he made life absolutely miserable. And he was the dean, which means he was in charge of the priests in that area. And so he used his power and influence to make life absolutely hell for Father Augustine. And so Father Augustine did his best. He really did his best. When it came down to the point where he almost felt like he couldn't even continue in his ministry, he couldn't even do what he was called to do, he went to the bishop and said, "Bishop, look, this is a horrible situation. I need some help." Well, the bishop, again, I wish he would have had a little more courage. He didn't. He didn't do anything. And so eventually he went back to the bishop and says, I think you need to move me. And the bishop concurred, and so they ended up moving him. So he moved to Chicago. He moved and became instrumental in starting the African community, African parish, African American community in Chicago. And from that point on, he basically worked himself to death. He literally worked himself into the ground. He worked so hard. And it was all for the sake of the parish. It was all for the sake of his people. And he died very young. I mean, he truly worked himself into the ground. Did he carry his cross? In other words, did he take his suffering and transform it into love? I think so. So he's a great example of that. You know, there's all kinds of little ways each and every day that we can bring our faith and make our faith real and have it be a manifestation of love. You know, I was at a restaurant last week. We had traveled south down to the Tacoma area. And when we were down in the Tacoma area, we stayed at a restaurant just for lunch, and the waiter came, and the waiter had a scapular on. And it was just kind of poking out through his shirt, and so he had a scapular on. And so I noticed the scapular, and I said, "Oh, nice scapular." Well, that changed the dynamics, because he's probably not used to anybody recognizing or saying anything about his faith. And so in that moment, he kind of changes the way he responds to us. And so I think we went from being a waiter and a customer to being brothers, right? Being brothers in the faith. This was kind of beautiful how that happened, but it was a simple little public recognition that he had his faith on him. Now, here's the other thing about the cross. You know, I know Jesus says that we're supposed to pray in quiet, we're supposed to pray in silence, we're supposed to go to our room and pray and not show off our faith, right? So I'm not talking about showing it off. But remember the cross. The cross is something done publicly. Jesus was crucified publicly. He was crucified in front of the people. And so the willingness to bear the shame in front of everyone is part of the cross. And so it's that completely submitting to the humiliation of it is where we grow in humility and we transform all of that into love. But we do it publicly, right? So when we're not being loved, we don't go off and hide. We don't hide that. Because oftentimes I think we do that. We hide our faith because of our shame, because we're proud. And then Jesus doesn't get out in publicly in the community. The other day, last week, so on Saturdays, I often prepare for my homily by just going down to this little grassy area in front of the marina in Tulalip. And so in the marina, you have lots of people working on their boats, and but they're all fishing, but mostly fishing boats. And there was a gentleman down there who was helping with someone, and I noticed right away, even though I was looking at him like 50 yards away, what I noticed was he was wearing a cross. He was wearing a big cross, right? It's like, that's nice. That's nice. It wasn't like showing it off, but it was there. And so little ways that we bring our faith out publicly, especially when things aren't going great, is important, right? Okay. Now, and I'm going to get to a final example of that in just a minute. So before I go to my final example, so remember Mary. So Mary, when she's at the foot of the cross. Now, you remember the prophecy about Mary. So the prophecy of Simeon, when they brought Jesus as a child to the temple. And so Simeon tells Mary that her heart will be pierced, right? So probably no more powerful moment that happens than when she's at the foot of the cross watching her son be killed, right? But what's transformative is Mary is at the foot of the cross, not really watching her son be killed. She's watching her son give his life out of love. And what Simeon says is that her heart will be pierced. Now, that's not just, Mary's going to suffer. But Mary too is going to have a cross, because he says your heart will be pierced so that the hearts and the minds of others will be revealed. So that the hearts and the minds of others will be revealed. And so she's going to she's going to endure this suffering as a cross to transform it into love for others so that their hearts and minds can be revealed. Now, what does that mean? It means that other people will be able to participate in this great act. And it will be revealed, it'll be made known, it'll be public, right? So, I talk to my mom fairly frequently, and we've been talking about the whole abuse scandal in the church. And I think my mom worries about me as a priest, and in this time, and she sees this as just really difficult time, and she says how horrible it is, and she's right, it is horrible. But she also knows I'm a little weird, and so one of the things that I was sharing with her was, in some ways, this is actually really, really good. That what we're going through is really good. Now, it's not good, the evil that's happened, the abuses that have happened, that's not good. But what's good is what is happening now to the church. Why? Because why does the church exist? For 2,000 years, what has been the job of the church? To carry the cross, right? To make it known publicly, to bear witness to Jesus Christ. That's what the job of the church is. And so right now, in this moment of shame, we are called to bear the cross publicly. And so if anybody comes out and tries to reject that, if anybody, a bishop, anybody, a priest, if they try to downplay it, if they try to hide it, if they, my mom was saying that her pastor never talks about it. He's never once mentioned this whole thing since it broke, 5 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago. And it's like there's this shame, and so we're not going to talk about it. That's wrong, because then we're rejecting the cross. And so we bear witness to it. We bear witness to Jesus' love publicly. And so the wounds, the harm that's been done, we bear witness to it. And we accept responsibility for it. And we hold people accountable for it. But we allow it to be done publicly. Now, if a bishop were to come out and say that it's evil that bishops are being accused, that it's being done publicly, that it's scandalizing the faithful, if somebody were to come out and say that, then I would say, no, they're wrong. This needs to happen. This is good. This is the cross. This is redemptive. This is where the church can shine. In the horribleness of all of this, this is where the church can really shine. To be humble, to accept responsibility, to bear the cross publicly. Right? We can do that. And that can be a very, very good thing. All right. God bless. I'll see you next week.